Couple of things, as I said, Monday, the Monday Thanksgiving break, you had these assignments due, and they're still available until Friday at 3:15. This past Monday, you saw that these assignments started showing up on Aries. They're available until 3:15 on Friday. And then these assignments will be due this module next Monday, the 7th, and be available till the 11th. So everything that we have, as I said, has to be done by December 11th. So anything dated after October 30th, you can still turn in for full credit, but it has to be done by 3:15 on Friday the 11th. So this week we will finish up World War I and talk about the specifics of how that finishes up, how the U.S. gets involved. Want to talk about the biggest military development probably during the time period, and why the war lasted so long was because of trench warfare. So I'll show you 2 short video clips on that, and we will be done. So go ahead and get to module 15. I'll put in the attendance and we'll roll through what we need to do. Okay, so as I said, what we're going to do is take a look at some of the specifics of World War I, how that wraps up, how the U.S. gets involved. The biggest thing that you will see in World War I and about World War I is this idea of trench warfare. And so what we have basically is a picture like this. The western part of Europe is much flatter. And to stop advancing armies, whether it was the Central Powers coming against the Allies or the Allies moving west-east against the Central Powers, they dug a bunch of trenches. And obviously the trenches here, this is a German side, much more detailed in how they built it. But what you have, and the reason that you have this, is that the view of, I'm going to get to this right here. Oops, it paused on me. Is a couple of things. So one, the area here on the eastern front, there were some trenches built, but most of this is more mountainous than this flat area here. So outside of the Alps, okay, right, you have the mountain range of the Alps right here along Switzerland and Italy, the highest mountain range in Europe. This area here is very flat. And so the Central Powers wanted to come across this way, take France, then get to Britain. Obviously, the Allied powers want to come this way and force their way to Germany and Austria-Hungary. And what they did was dig trenches. And that was to stop the assault on the Western Front. And so here's some specifics about that. All right, it's estimated there are about 1,580 miles of trench line during World War I that was dug by both the Allies and the Central Powers. Now, 1,580 miles is going to be roughly the distance between, say, Los Angeles and Minneapolis. Most of them were very dirty. They would flood with water. They wouldn't drain. And you have some pretty miserable weather for 3 months of the year there. Many soldiers living in the trenches suffered what was called trench foot, all right, where basically they would catch disease in their foot. They'd have their foots amputated, their toes amputated. And then basically you had rotation of soldiers through these trench lines from the reserves to the staging area, they called it, which was behind the trenches and then the trenches, and they would rotate those. Generally, the trenches were dug in zigzag formation so that you could stop if there was a breakthrough. So if you dig in a zigzag, manner like this, it's easier to defend. So if you have, let's say, somebody come from this direction and break through the line here, you can still, right, attack and counterattack this way. Where if you had dug a trench in a straight line like this, if they break through, right, they just run right through to the next town area and they can cover a lot of ground. So that's why they were dug in zigzag lines like that. So trenches typically had an embankment at the top with a barbed wire fence to stop people from coming over. And then on both sides, because both sides did this, the Allies and the Central Powers, if you had trenches here, all right, this area here in the middle is called no man's land. And there were mines planted there. And basically you were uncovered because the terrain was so flat, very little trees in some areas, you could easily be shot. So the trenches were dug by soldiers, and there were three ways that you could dig them in terms of making them as accessible as possible. It was very difficult to sleep in the trenches. Most of the attacks occurred in the early morning hours, right, when there was just barely enough daylight to see, but still dark enough that maybe you could be camouflaged in a way. So as I said, terrible conditions. If you took all of the trenches that ended up being built in all or dug in all of World War I, you're looking at almost the entire trip around the Earth, right? 25 miles long. The equator is what, 24,396 all the way around the Earth. So it is a lot of trenches, and that's why you have a stalemate in the Great War. It's not called World War I until we have World War II, but it is a reason that the war was somewhat prolonged on the Western Front because of what happens. So let me reset this so you can see it. The United States, remember, at the beginning stays out of the war, right? The United States at the beginning stays out of the war because they didn't see it as something that pertained to them. All right, but this changes over a period of time. Woodrow Wilson's president of the United States during World War I, and he wanted to stay out of the war. But there are 5 things that were working against him, and basically the United States joins the war, and that's what forces sort of the conclusion of the war in a quicker fashion, because the United States military supplies, military equipment, and then the sheer number of soldiers that we send over there to defeat the Central Powers. So the biggest reason, or the first reason that you have, is this unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans, after Napoleon, started to build up many of their military branches, and one of them was what would be a navy. And they had what was called U-boats, underwater boats. So these are the first types of submarines. The Germans basically said, look, we are going to sink anything that is of military nature. If you have a commercial ship that is shipping military items, equipment, arsenal, bombs, what have you, we're going to sink that too. And so what they do is they sink the Lusitania. The Lusitania left the east coast of the United States. It is later discovered, as the Germans correctly claimed, there was British munitions in the hull of the ship that they were trying to hide and get to Britain. And so this, what was considered, right, an unprovoked attack on innocent civilians in a cruise liner made sort of the Germans the barbarians. That's barbaric. We don't kill innocent people. So propaganda posters, and you don't have radio at this point, so newspapers are the only means of media in which people get their news. They depict the German Kaiser and the German people, the German military, specifically those U-boat captains, as barbarians. And it urged Americans in newspapers and political cartoons to support the Allies throughout this neutrality, but let's put our support behind people that don't kill innocent civilians on a cruise liner. You also have this idea that the Germans are run basically by the Kaiser, who is in essence a dictator, that the United States has more cultural ties with these allied countries, right? The Republic of France, Great Britain, who has a king at this time and a queen, a monarchy, but are more parliamentary and more democratic than Germany. U.S. business interests in terms of how much money are made. The trade with allies in World War I increases just in 2 years by 3 times the amount. So in 1914, U.S. companies trading with France and Britain and other allied countries, 825 million in profit. By 1916, it's 3.2 billion in profit. So the war is very prosperous for them in terms of what happens. And then really what turned the public opinion from we're going to support the Allies but remain neutral to now we need to go over there and help the Allies defeat the Germans, who are seen as the leader of the Central Powers. Germany sends a secret telegraph to Mexico called the Zimmerman Note, in which Germany asks Mexico to attack the United States along the border of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The Germans agree then to help in the fight against the Americans and give back land that Mexico once had owned in the 1800s and earlier if they attacked the U.S. and made them or occupied them with a war in their own hemisphere. And once that happens, there's nothing that Wilson can do to stop people from wanting to enter the war. And that's when the United States enters the war, and the war will turn very quickly, as it had not before, where it's going to be over in about 18 to 20 months, where it had been dragging on since 1914. All right, I want to show you 2 videos. A couple of the scenes are pretty graphic in terms of the trench foot and what it does to people. So if you want to look away at those points, you can. But let me show you what life in a trench is like, and then sort of the facts of the trench warfare.
Skip this video if you're not interested in awesome tracking technology for your vehicles or fleet. Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Into life!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. So their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start in a minute.
It was just the day-to-day monotony, being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on. And as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops. So the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day the bullet was going to have your name on it. You were going to perish. You weren't going home.
Okay. So most of that, right, is pretty accurate in terms of when you think World War I starts in 1914, goes through 1915, goes through 1916. You're 3 years and there has not been much movement, maybe a mile shoot on either side. That is why, as the United States comes in, things accelerate because of the amount of equipment and the amount of soldiers that are provided. Now, the other thing to realize during World War I is that the British, the French, the Germans, they basically lose an entire generation of males between the ages of 18 and 24. It's unbelievable the amount of death that you have from that. This next clip, as I said, has some pretty gruesome pictures of trench foot, what it does to your toes, amputations, things like that. So if you want to look away, you might do that.
Trench warfare is a war tactic or way of fighting that was commonly used on the Eastern Front and the Western Front in World War I. In trench warfare, the two sides fighting each other dig trenches in the battlefield to stop the enemy from advancing. The World War I trenches could stretch many miles and made it almost impossible for one side to advance on the other. The Western Front in World War I was located in France, and that was fought using trench warfare. World War I started on the 28th of June, 1914, and by the end of 1914, both sides had built trenches that went from the North Sea and through Belgium and France. Neither side made much ground for nearly 3.5 years, from October 1914 to March of 1918. Here are some facts about World War I trenches that you may not have known. It's estimated that there were about 2,490 kilometers of trench lines dug during World War I. Most trenches were between 1 to 2 meters wide and about 3 meters deep. Life in the trenches was very difficult because they were dirty and flooded in bad weather. Many of the trenches also had pests living in the trenches, including rats, lice, and frogs. Rats in particular were a problem, and they ate the soldiers' food as well as the actual soldiers while they slept. Lice also caused a disease called trench fever that made the soldiers itch terribly and caused fever, headache, sore muscles, bones, and joints. Many soldiers living in the trenches suffer from a condition called trench foot. Rain and bad weather would flood the trenches, making them boggy, muddy, and could even block weapons and make it hard to move in battle. The sustained exposure to the wet, muddy conditions could cause trench foot, which sometimes would result in the foot being amputated. Cold weather was dangerous too, and soldiers often lost fingers or toes to frostbite. Some soldiers also died from exposure to the cold. Soldiers in World War I rotated through 3 stages of the front line. Most soldiers would spend anywhere from 1 day up to 2 weeks in the trenches at a time. They spent some time in the frontline trenches, time in the support trenches, and also they spent time resting. Even when they weren't fighting, soldiers had work to do, including repairing the trenches, moving supplies, cleaning weapons, undergoing inspections, or guard duty. The trenches weren't actually dug in straight lines, but were instead dug in a zigzag pattern. The World War I trenches were built as a system in a zigzag pattern with many different levels along the lines. They had paths dug in them so that soldiers could move between the levels. The trenches typically had an embankment at the top with a barbed wire fence. Often, the trenches in World War I would be reinforced with sandbags and wooden beams. In the trench itself, the bottom was covered with wooden boards called duck boards. These were meant to protect the soldiers' feet from the water in the trenches to try and prevent trench foot. The land between the 2 enemy trench lines was called no man's land. No man's land was sometimes covered with landmines and barbed wire. The distance between enemy trenches was anywhere from 50 to 250 yards apart. The trenches were dug by soldiers, and there were 3 ways to dig them. Sometimes the soldiers would simply dig the trenches straight into the ground, a method known as entrenching. Entrenching was fast, but the soldiers were open to enemy fire while they dug. The second method was to extend a trench on one end. It was called sapping. It was a safer method, but it took a lot longer. Tunneling, which was the third method, was a way of digging the tunnel and then removing the roof to make the trench when it was complete. It was the safest method because there was no enemy fire, but it was also the most difficult to do. Sleeping in the trenches was also very difficult. The noise and uncomfortable surroundings made it very difficult for soldiers to sleep in the trenches. They were constantly tired and in danger of falling asleep. This is why the watch shift was kept 2 hours to avoid men falling asleep while on watch. There were several times when ceasefires and truces happened in the trenches during World War I. One example was in 1914, around Christmas time, both the British and German soldiers put down their weapons. They came out of the trenches and exchanged gifts and sung carols to each other, ceasing fire to celebrate Christmas together. Today, this is known as the Christmas truce. If all the trenches built along the Western Front in World War I were laid end to end, it's estimated that they would be about 25,000 miles long. Trenches needed to be repaired constantly to prevent erosion from the weather and from enemy bombs and gunfire. It took 450 men 6 hours to build around 250 meters of British trenches. The majority of raids in World War I happened at night when soldiers would sneak across no man's land, dodging mines to attack the enemies in darkness. Soldiers would stand too. This is when they stand up and prepare for battle because many attacks would take place first thing in the morning. A typical World War I soldier would have a rifle, a bayonet, and a hand grenade with them while fighting in the trenches. We hope you enjoyed these interesting facts about the World War I trenches. If you want more information on World War I,
Right. So just absolutely crazy in terms of what you have. But that militarily is the biggest probably development that you have as opposed to previous wars. And as we said, it's not until the United States comes into the war, late 16, early 17, that World War I will end November 11th of 18 and be done. So if you have not completed module 13 or 14 or turn both of those in, that's what you'll want to do. I know that Unit 8 had some questions at the end that I forgot about that were related to this trench warfare. So if you want to retake Test 8, let me know, and I can erase what you did and you can take it over again. If you want to try to better your score, that's fine by me. But you should turn in module 13 and 14 work first. If you want to get ahead, the 2 sets of review questions are the only thing that we'll have this week, and I'll go over those